This meeting is now being recorded.
Okay, today we have Matt Bunn from Harvard. Matt has spent most of his career working on trying to prevent the theft or diversion of nuclear materials, and as part of that, he's looked into the issue of insider threats, which is what he'll talk about today. So, Matt.
All right. Thanks very much, David, and thanks for having me. So this talk is based on a book that Scott Sagan and I have just published with Cornell University Press. You can see the cover of it right here. The basic idea, as David mentioned, I've been working on nuclear security for a long time, and you observe there that almost all of the important incidents, all of the thefts of highly enriched uranium and plutonium that we know about how it happened, and most of the sabotages where we know about how it happened were perpetrated with insiders being involved. But there's so few that we couldn't really learn very many lessons. And so we thought, let's broaden out. Let's look at the insider problem more broadly across different organizations. So we put together an edited volume. This is the various chapters. Most of it is in-depth case studies. So Amy Ziegart has an excellent and fascinating story of the first Fort Hood shooter and why the Army and other investigative organizations failed to deal with the situation before it unfolded. Similarly, Jessica Stern and Ron Schutten have a chapter on the anthrax letters. Austin Long on the problem that arose in Afghanistan a couple of years ago of a huge number of Afghan forces attacking their U.S. trainers and assisters. Kate Glynn and I have a chapter looking at, casinos and pharmaceuticals have a profit incentive to get insider security right. How do they think about the problem? And it starts off with an interesting chapter from Thomas Heckhammer and Andreas Daly about looking at the whole corpus of jihadi writing, postings on the dark web, and so on, looking for what they think about using insiders at nuclear facilities. So what we found is that there are lessons you can learn across different kinds of organizations, and that a lot of the problem has to do with cognitive biases that humans have and organizational biases that most organizations have. Insiders are a serious threat to pretty much any high security organization out there. Always have been, probably always will be. Part of the problem is that, once you have given someone access and worked with them, that they become a trusted person. And people by their nature tend to believe the evidence that reconfirms what they already think and discount the evidence that doesn't. And they tend, when they have one positive feeling about somebody, they tend to think that that person has other desirable characteristics as well. So there's lots of data, for example, that says people assume that attractive people are intelligent, which is, of course, uncorrelated to first approximation. And people think they have sort of more control over what's going on around them than they actually do. And all of those lead us to ignore what, in retrospect, seem like obvious warning signs. And then often in organizations, there are additional organizational aspects. So if you're the only one raising a concern about something, it's not going to make you popular within your organization. In Japan, they have a great saying, which is sort of the opposite of the squeaky wheel gets the grease, which is the nail that sticks up gets pounded down. And that is often a problem in organizations related to convincing people to report on potential indicators of an insider threat. And all of that put together means that sometimes even amazingly obvious red flags will get ignored, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. Okay, I keep trying to hit the page down, and the software I'm using doesn't let me actually do that. So, lesson number one. we offer sort of a set of lessons. In an earlier version, we called them worst practices, and actually in the final chapter, we call them worst practices because they're lessons from past disasters. And the first one is sort of the most fundamental, which is don't assume you don't have any insiders in your organization. We find a bias often where people say, oh, you know, all the people in my organization have been through a security clearance, they won't be insiders, or I know all these people, I trust them, they won't be insiders. So we named the bias NIMO for not in my organization. And one example is Indira Gandhi's assassination. She had just ordered a military assault on a very sacred Sikh temple. Her security manager said to her, gee, for the time being, the Sikhs on the security force, you ought to separate from, you know, your personal security detail. We'll deploy them out on the perimeter or something. And she said, no. I'm the prime minister for everyone, including the Sikhs, and I trust these people. And she was gunned down by 2 Sikhs on her bodyguard, one of whom was her personal trusted favorite who'd been guarding her for years, the one in the image there, Bayant Singh. The other was a relative, Bayant Singh, which another lesson is don't put 2 relatives together in a highly sensitive position because the odds of having more than one insider conspiring together will increase if you do that. So similarly, in the NSA and its contractors, they had a system, as Clapper put it, that where the whole system was based on personal trust. And we have this amazing quote from the CEO of Booz Allen Hamilton that Snowden was working for, saying that Booz Allen is trusted as you trust, you know, your most trusted colleagues and friends. You can always count on them. Well, not anymore, presumably. Now, one can have, of course, a lot of different views of Snowden and what he did, but from the point of view of the organization that he was working for, it was a devastating event. All right, so the second lesson, don't assume that background checks will solve the problem. So first of all, background checks aren't perfect. Lots of people pass background checks and are nonetheless insider threats. Aldrich Ames is a classic case. For those of you who may not remember, he was one of the most devastating spies in CIA history. He sold quite a number of U.S. agents to Soviet intelligence, and the U.S. agents were then captured and in some cases executed. Leonid Smirnov perpetrated the first really well-documented case of large theft of highly enriched uranium, weapon-grade highly enriched uranium in 1992. And he'd been an employee at that facility for many years, was completely trusted, and passed background checks and so on. Aldrich Ames passed lie detector tests. Even if the background checks worked, once the loyal employees can be coerced. So this bank in Ireland, the Northern Bank, had a perfectly sensible security system that required 2 senior officers of the bank to turn their keys to open the vault, and a gang kidnapped the families of 2 senior officers of the bank, and sure enough, they turned their keys. So people can also be radicalized after they pass a background check. So in the case of this sabotage that the image on the previous slide, or an earlier slide, mentioned at Doel 4 in Belgium in 2014, they still don't know what insider perpetrated that sabotage or why. An insider essentially opened a valve that let all the lubricant for the turbine drain out, and the turbine overheated and destroyed itself, and it caused $100 million to $200 million worth of damage, all told. So it's one of the largest economic sabotages of all time. So, as I said, they still don't know who did that. They started investigating, and they found that years before, so not involved in this sabotage, at the same facility there had been a person who had cleared a background check for access to the vital area, who had then resigned his position to go off and fight for the Islamic State in Syria. guy by the name of Ilyas Bugalab, who was later convicted in absentia for terrorist crimes in Belgium. He's believed to have been killed in Syria subsequent to that. But his family said, well, he was radicalized after he passed the background check in a matter of a few months. So that raises interesting questions about background checks and reinvestigations and so on. For my clearance, for example, I need to be reinvestigated every 5 years. Well, if I can be radicalized in 6 months, that may not be sufficient. So, bottom line, don't assume that background checks will solve the insider problem by themselves. They're important. They're worthwhile, but they don't solve the problem. Lesson 3, don't assume that red flags are going to be read correctly. So this, again, is the story of the Fort Hood shooter. There were many red flags in his case. He had actually expressed support for Osama bin Laden. He was emailing with al-Awlaki. And what's more, he had a variety of odd behavior and just poor behavior, poor performance on the job, which, constant lateness and poor performance is also often an indicator of a possible future insider issue. But the way the Army performance evaluation system was set up, you had two sets of records, the records that were only kept on site and the records that went with you when you went to the new assignment. And there was huge pressure not to put negative stuff in the records that went with somebody throughout their career. They had the opportunity to push back if you did that. Also, the next commander might not be willing to take them if there was lots of negative stuff in their report, and so you might be stuck with that problem employee if you put stuff in their report. And so the reports that went with Hassan had basically nothing negative in them. And so when investigators started looking into the fact that he was emailing with a known terrorist, they looked at his performance reports and said, well, everybody seems to think he's fine. And so they wrote it off as, praiseworthy research on the threat that he was emailing with this terrorist. By the way, without ever interviewing him, which is remarkable in and of itself. So you can have a lot of red flags and still the organization doesn't react. That was actually, I would say, the thing that most surprised me in doing this project was just the scale of red flags that organizations are able to ignore. So we have another case study on that, which is Bruce Ivins, who almost certainly committed the anthrax attacks in 2001. We'll never know for absolute certain because he committed suicide before the court case could proceed. But his earliest therapists decades ago had decided that he was the most dangerous patient they'd ever seen in their entire careers. And although he signed many documents giving the organization access to his medical records, nobody ever bothered to look. He sent an email to his staff complaining that his paranoia was getting worse and worse and speculating about ending up in the newspaper with a headline of mad scientist in charge of deadly anthrax, and nobody bothered to report that. At one point, one of his subordinates became so terrified of him that she went to his boss and said, "I'm afraid he's going to hurt me." And his boss just said, "Oh, well, there's this part of the facility that he doesn't have access to at the moment. Why don't you just work there for the time being?" And nobody did anything about that. And part of that was he'd been such a strange person for so long, had been eccentric for so long, that it sort of immunized the organization. People just wrote off any behavior as just Bruce being Bruce. If he had gotten the medical help that he needed sooner, he would have been better off. He'd probably still be alive today, and a number of other people would still be alive today. Lesson 4, don't assume that insider conspiracies aren't going to happen. Over and over, security managers think, there's only going to be one insider if there's ever an insider. We did a survey of nuclear security experts from most of the countries that have plutonium or highly enriched uranium, and most of them saw a single insider as credible but didn't think a conspiracy was credible. Yet if you look at real cases of theft, non-nuclear thefts from heavily guarded facilities, it's more often than not that there's more than one insider when there's any insider at all. So insider conspiracies are not a rare, incredible event. They're something that does happen in the real world. And so to the extent practical, we have to find ways to design security systems that can handle, at least to some degree, dealing with more than one insider working together. That's very tricky and difficult to do, especially when the insiders are among the guards running the security system, which is often the case in these non-nuclear thefts. Lesson 5, don't rely on just a single protection measure. Pretty much any particular security measure can be beaten. Portal monitors, it's remarkable what people can come up with for either defeating a portal monitor or going around it, flushing material down a toilet and then intercepting the pipe leading from the toilet, and things of that kind. Seals can be defeated. Roger Johnston and his colleagues years ago did a study where they looked at over 150 commercially available types of seals and showed that every single one that they could get their hands on could be defeated with material from any hardware store with average defeat times of less than 5 minutes. It took them a lot more time than that to think of the defeat. And by a defeat, I mean not just breaking the seal, but breaking the seal and taking whatever was supposed to be sealed and then resealing it in a way that wouldn't be detected with the seal inspection protocols then in place. If you were relying on staff to report concerning behavior, you're in trouble because oftentimes they don't, as the previous lesson indicated. So really, ultimately, you need a comprehensive, multi-layered approach. And even a comprehensive approach, sometimes thieves will really think hard. This is an image of the Antwerp Diamond Center heist, where, there was a vault door that connected to the local police. There was camera right outside the vault door. The vault door required both a key and a combination. All of the safe deposit boxes inside had strong locks on them. There were monitors inside the vault, and the thieves collected intelligence for over 2 years, including becoming insiders by setting up their own gem business and then renting a box in the vault, and managed to figure out ways to defeat all the security measures in place. There's a terrific book called Flawless, if you want more on that particular amazing heist. Very much a real-world Ocean's 11 kind of situation. I'm surprised a movie hasn't been made yet. So another lesson is don't assume that culture doesn't matter or that employee disgruntlement doesn't matter. So most of you heard about the Y-12 intrusion in 2012. The protesters set off alarm after alarm. No one responded for tens of minutes, actually over an hour. It turned out they had a new intrusion detection system, and it was setting off all sorts of false alarms. Normally, you could just use cameras to check those out, but the cameras had been broken for months, and nobody had bothered to fix them. And so they were sending out, the compensatory measure for that was to send out a guard to check out the alarm. But with so many false alarms, the guards had gotten sick of it. So there was a major breakdown in security culture that neither the site itself nor Department of Energy headquarters was aware had happened. They didn't really understand how far the organization had drifted from effective security until these protesters did their intrusion. I actually think that rather than throwing them in jail, we should have given them a medal for, highlighting some vulnerabilities without causing any substantial amount of damage, and thereby allowing us to fix them before something worse happened. So similarly, on the disgruntlement front, Chelsea Manning is an obvious case. It was a combination of disgruntlement and emotional disturbance in her case. She was in the don't ask, don't tell military with a dawning understanding of her transgender identity, and she was a chronically poor performer. She was constantly late and not, doing her job, and she was told, well, we're getting rid of your weekly day off because you're late all the time. And she flipped over the table, went for the gun rack in the room, and had to be restrained. And 3 weeks later, she starts downloading this massive quantity of information. It turns out, actually, that there's a good deal that organizations can do to deal with disgruntlement, which is also seen in almost all cyber sabotage cases. They come up after some kind of negative work event. Somebody's been punished or fired or what have you. And if you just listen to employees, if you have a good complaints process where they can come and complain and you say, I understand, that's really too bad that that's happening, sort of validating their concern and every once in a while taking action to address a complaint and visibly so that employees can see that, in fact, sometimes the complaints are addressed, you can really reduce employee disgruntlement a good bit without spending a huge amount of money. Lesson 7, don't forget that insiders may know about the security measures. So Robert Hansen is a great case of that. Again, for those of you who don't know, he was an FBI agent and charged with looking for spies. And because he was charged with looking for spies, he understood how the spy searches went. And so, becoming a spy himself, he understood how to avoid getting caught. And he kept spying for many, many years, compromised many agents who, again, were captured, executed, imprisoned for extended periods, etc. So he was able to actually watch the investigations of spying unfold, see, how they were trying to catch spies and so on, and change his practices so that he wouldn't come up against the counterintelligence efforts that were being taken. And Snowden is another example of knowing about the security measures. As an NSA systems administrator, one of his jobs was to look for the security weaknesses in the computer system. So he was totally familiar with the security weaknesses in the computer system. And it's not 100% clear whether he arranged to be transferred to the Hawaii site because he knew they hadn't installed the security software there yet that would monitor downloading zillions of files. But it is true that they hadn't installed the software there yet, and that's the place he arranged to be transferred to. So it's at least a plausible hypothesis that might have been part of the purpose of being transferred there. So he was able to use very simple tools to download all the files that he downloaded without being noticed. Lesson 8, don't assume that the security rules are always going to be followed. I don't know how many of you have ever been in a large organization with security rules, but I'd be willing to wager if you have been, you've violated some of those rules at some point. In my own case, I am constantly late in notifying the U.S. government when I'm going to be traveling and writing my trip reports after I get back. It's just, people don't get around to it. Every hour that you spend following security rules is an hour that you didn't spend in most organizations doing something that would be more likely to get you promoted or to get you a raise or praise or what have you. So this comes up all the time. I have a couple of examples here on the slide of guards, whether it's patrolling without ammunition in their guns, turning off intrusion detectors. But it's not just guards. It's people throughout organizations violate the security rules if it's more convenient for them to do so. So what's really going on is often a lot different than what's in the rule book. I love this photograph. This is a security fence that had been provided with U.S. assistance at a nuclear site in Russia. and the door is just propped open. And what's amazing about this photograph is that it was propped open on the day the people from the Government Accountability Office were there to take a photo of it being propped open, which indicates that the people at the site really didn't see it as an issue that it was propped open. But, of course, the rule said it shouldn't be. Another example of not following security rules is people cheat on security tests. If the security tests are important to, for example, the corporate bonuses or individuals' pay or promotions or what have you. In 2004, the DOE Inspector General found that Wackenhut had been cheating on security exercises at Y-12. They'd been warning the guards about, where the mock attackers were going to attack and when, so that the guards were then able to sort of place extra defense on the pathways that the attackers were going to take and put the best guards in the best places and so on. And there's also at least some suggestion that they tampered with the essentially laser tag type equipment to make the guards essentially unkillable because the equipment they were wearing wouldn't detect when they were hit with the laser tag lasers. All right, don't assume that only the consciously malicious actions matter. Sometimes inadvertent insiders can have a devastating impact. So in the New York prison break a couple of years ago at the Clinton Correctional Facility, Gene Palmer developed a relationship with one of the inmates, and his idea was he was getting information from the inmate about what was going on with the other inmates to help him do his guarding job better. And so he, helped the inmate with some things that he saw as completely innocent, gave him some tools. He gave them access to this catwalk you can see here, and those turned out to be essential elements of the escape plan. He also gave them a big chunk of hamburger that had been provided by another insider, and apparently, at least Gene Palmer claims he had no idea that that big chunk of hamburger had, I think it was a hacksaw, among other things, hidden inside it. But this inadvertent insider issue comes up all the time in cyber cases. John Podesta clicks on a link, and that lets the attackers in, and they get all of his email. And that kind of thing happens all the time. Iran's Natanz enrichment facility was not connected to the Internet, but somehow Stuxnet got in, presumably either an intentional insider or, if I had to guess, more likely an inadvertent insider probably brought in a USB stick or something, and the software got in there. The phishing attacks that try to get us to click on things are becoming more and more sophisticated. They can look at your social media accounts, find out, what you're interested in, who you're talking to, make emails that look like they're coming from a close colleague writing about something it's totally plausible that close colleague would be writing you about, and get you to click on the links that way. And so separating networks from the Internet, making sure, for example, your nuclear power plant's control system isn't connected to the Internet, that's important. But it ain't good enough because all sorts of things get brought in and connected. A contractor testing a piece of software will connect a laptop to a system, and those kinds of things can get past those air gaps. And, of course, it's also true that intentional insiders are also a major issue. But the key lesson here is don't assume that I'm only worried about those intentional people. 10th, don't assume that only prevention is important and neglect mitigation. So in the case of nuclear sabotage, for example, if you've got really good safety measures and emergency response systems, it makes it harder for the system to melt down, which makes it harder for somebody to cause it to melt down on purpose as well. If you went to really passively designed reactors where there really wasn't much that a human had to do, it makes it much harder for humans to figure out how to cause the thing to melt down. And similarly with theft, if you have the material in big and heavy forms, if you have it with low concentration of nuclear material so that you'd have to do some chemically processing to make it into a bomb, you can somewhat reduce the chance that even if it does get stolen, it could then be used in a bomb. Not as much as the staff of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is currently arguing you can reduce that, but it is important to think about the mitigation aspect and not just the prevention aspect. So those are our 10 rules. Let me talk a little bit about Hegghammer and Daly's chapter, because they offer an important caveat, which is that, the jihadis in their writings don't actually talk much about nuclear. And they haven't done a whole lot on nuclear. So there's essentially, they only rarely talk about nuclear sabotage or nuclear theft in the vast corpus of writings that the jihadis have put out. And they never mention, let's think about recruiting an insider at a nuclear facility. They were unable to find any mention of that particular tactic. And there aren't any known cases of jihadis actively attempting to recruit insiders at nuclear facilities. On the other hand, as a caveat to the caveat, there are a lot of disturbing hints in this direction. So first of all, as I mentioned at the outset, nearly all of the known nuclear thefts or the known nuclear sabotage incidents where we know how it happened had a role for insiders, a major enabling role of insiders. Often it was just insiders by themselves doing the whole thing. And jihadists do routinely use insiders, including insiders that have been coerced by, for example, kidnapping their families in other contexts. So that was a routine Chechen tactic in the Chechen wars, for example, was if they wanted a security official to, open a back door or something like that. And then we do have this case of Ilyas Bugalov, who I mentioned earlier, which sort of highlights the potential. He left to fight in Syria because that was at the time when that's what ISIS was still telling people to do. Come to Syria, join the caliphate. It's an interesting question. What would have happened had he gotten radicalized after ISIS started sending the message, carry out attacks where you are, which is the message they're sending today. So there isn't a lot of jihadi writing about this, but that doesn't mean that it's not a threat we have to worry about. I would argue, had there been such an active jihadi internet presence prior to 9/11, that you probably wouldn't have seen a whole lot of discussion of flying planes into buildings. You don't have your guys post on the internet about the really secret plot that you're hoping to carry out. All right, so that's the main thrust of the arguments we're making in this book. But there's a lot of questions that are still out there. The insider threat is a deep question. It's been around for a long time. There may well be other lessons we've missed. And we don't, I would say, have enough in the book about, well, what are the positive lessons? What are the things that work to protect against insider threats? I think there's still a lot more to be learned about that. How can organizations counter the complacency that builds up about insiders and so on? And how can they find the balance between being vigilant for insiders while at the same time building the kind of trust and cooperation that organizations need to be successful? Organizations can easily tear themselves apart, with everybody suspecting everybody else, as James Jesus Angleton almost managed to destroy the CIA's intelligence gathering capability by thinking everybody was a spy within the agency, or even outside the agency. I mean, he thought Henry Kissinger was a Soviet spy, among other things. And so what are the most important costs and risks of too much or misdirected focus on possible insiders is another deep question that I think there's more research to be done on. So with that, I will stop and leave it to discussion and questions.
Okay, thanks, Matt. If you have a question, let us know. I wanted to start off by asking if you had thought at all about or have data on sort of cultural aspects of this. Do you find that there are, do you have enough data to be able to say that there seem to be some countries where this doesn't seem to be as much of a problem for whatever reason?
So I definitely think there are cultural aspects. We did not have an opportunity to get into that in this book. This is a slim volume, and we've mainly got U.S. case studies. I think that's a great area for further research. From talking to security managers in different countries so far, I would say, just as with safety, if you have a country where the culture is, obedience to whatever the boss says is what goes, that it raises a difficulty for having a real questioning attitude. And that you need to find ways to sort of encourage people to have a questioning attitude even in very hierarchical national cultures. There are also cultures, Asian cultures often, where things are much more about the group than the individual, and there's a big emphasis on solving problems within the group rather than, letting an issue go outside the group. And I suspect, though I don't have strong data, that makes the likelihood of reporting on concerning behavior going outside the group lower than it would be in other cultures that weren't as group focused. But I think this issue of how do different cultures affect security and how do we design our organizational approach to take the national culture into account. You can't, I think, just have one set of best practices that is implemented in a cookie-cutter way regardless of what country you're in and what the cultural norms in that country are.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Aaron has asked a question. Do you have a microphone, Aaron?
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead. Why don't you go ahead and ask it?
Oh, great. Yeah. Hi, Matt. How's it going?
All right.
Definitely some really interesting points here, especially about the red flags. One question that I had, and this is kind of more about some organizational challenges. I was intrigued by the Nadal Hassan case, and as well as the Chelsea Manning case, and you noted some of the red flags, including like mental health records. And from my experience, these are important and can be important for red flags, but are also privately held records that even after signing certain waivers, they're still HIPAA protected. So if you're a counterintelligence personnel, you would need to get special permission to view those. So given those type of restrictions and kind of bureaucratic challenges, should there be exceptions? Where should, what should that balance be between protecting personnel privacy and insider threat?
So I think it's a great and challenging question. I think, you're not going to get the best people to work in really high security organizations if you make those organizations feel like prisons. And so there inevitably has to be a balance between how much you ask people to give up of their own personal privacy and, your level of protection that you're trying to achieve. And it may be that I would argue that often, while we need to structure organizations so that people will, for example, report on concerning behavior, that we shouldn't rely too much on that working, because oftentimes people don't. And so we should try to the extent we can to figure out security measures that don't require human beings to do what sort of goes against their instinct and their sort of cognitive biases. So, rather than, assuming that people will report on whether people are going to the vault frequently, let's make sure that we're actually monitoring the vault and that nobody can get in there except with special authorization and with someone else accompanying them and with a camera monitoring them and so on. I think we can compensate a little bit for human frailties with appropriate design of the technical systems. I do think also, back to the privacy question, I do think in the particular case of Bruce Ivins, it was long enough ago that HIPAA hadn't been passed yet, and the things he signed would have given, direct access to records that, had they been examined by his bosses and other people in the organization, he would have been taken off. I'm pretty confident he would have been taken off access to pathogens more or less immediately. What's more interesting is what happens in the future. And you're right, privacy is a major issue. If you look at Department of Energy counterintelligence, for example, if someone who's a Department of Energy staff member at a highly sensitive nuclear facility is worshiping at a radical mosque, that's not something you're supposed to report to counterintelligence because it's not their business. We have religious freedom in this country, right?
That's right.
And that was a big surprise to one of my colleagues who became head of DOE counterintelligence. He was like, "What? I'm not allowed to know if they're worshiping at radical mosques? Seriously?" But so we need to find other ways of identifying, whether people are posing a serious hazard. One piece of good news is that overwhelmingly, in almost all the cases, insiders are not very good at being secretive insiders. They say stuff that, if you can get people to report it, raises flags fairly early on. One interesting fact, there's a number of companies now in the cyber world who are developing software that does, natural language processing and so on, and basically monitors what insiders are saying on every platform. And mostly it's used in the corporate world, where it turns out that to protect against insider trading, we actually require people to give up a lot more of their privacy than, I'm required to give up, even though I have nuclear weapon design clearances. So, although nobody made this decision consciously, it appears that as a society we have concluded it's more important to prevent insider trading than it is to protect nuclear weapons designs. Or maybe that the balance is different because we need, really qualified scientists who don't want to give up so much of their privacy to do the nuclear weapon design stuff.
And just one comment. It seems to me that a lot of the kind of after actions that occur to put some of these protections in place, so for example, after the Bob Hansen case, all FBI employees were required to, on an annual basis, submit financial disclosure forms. But these were all voluntary. These were based off.
Right. It's self-reporting.
It's self-reporting, and so of course that information was available to CI counterintelligence personnel, or counterintelligence investigators. But if they wanted to go further, they would have to get basically a warrant.
Right.
So, it's sort of self-defeatist in a sense.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's totally plausible that people with nuclear weapon design clearances like myself, it would be a plausible story to say the government needs to have access to their bank accounts. That isn't the decision we've made at the moment, but it would seem to me a plausible argument that should be done.
Sure. Thank you.
If anybody else has a question, let me know. Matt, I mentioned to you one time, and I thought it might be worth just saying a word about it here, that we had a fellow from China a number of years ago who was working on materials control and really sort of refused to see the possibility of the insider threat, believing that the tests they put in place for people who were in that position were trustworthy.
Mm-hmm.
And my question was from your...
So he suffers from the NIMO bias, which is widespread in the world.
But I'm curious to what extent you have been able to look at the Chinese case and find out to what extent that's changed or people are taking that more into account.
It's interesting that he was working on material control if he wasn't interested in the insider threat, because the main point of material control, other than making your manufacturing processes work better, is to deal with the insider threat.
Actually, I think he was actually doing more material security than accounting. Yeah.
It's my strong impression that at least in the cooperation that goes on between the United States and China on nuclear security, that the Chinese have been interested in discussions about coping with the insider threat, and there have been quite a number of workshops, and the Chinese have been sophisticated in their thinking on the subject, making comments and asking questions in a way that made it very clear that they'd thought deeply and hard about the subject. Now, that's a set of people that they bring to meetings with the U.S. That cooperation does not, unlike the Russian cooperation, involve U.S. experts going to a whole bunch of sites and, chatting with the people who are actually doing security on a day-to-day basis. So how much that view and understanding, has percolated into actual implementation at sites, I think the U.S. doesn't have a good understanding of.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's see, Mark Cabrood, let me unmute you.
Hello. Hi, Matt. So I sort of objected to your discussing the case of Chelsea Manning and his, or at the time, his personal issues when I regard what he did as basically an act of conscience. And the difference, Hassan also was objecting to the Iraq War, but Chelsea Manning did not shoot anybody or steal any nuclear material or anthrax anybody. So I think maybe we should make a distinction there. You didn't discuss the case of Daniel Ellsberg, but I think what this exposes is kind of the raggedy edges here when there is a threat to security due to the ethical issues of what the organization is doing. I understand that you're discussing the security from the point of view of the organization. You're primarily concerned with nuclear security, where we could all agree that it would be a bad thing for anybody to steal nuclear material, no matter what they thought their ideological reasons were. But in general, I think we need to be concerned about this other aspect of it, where really, your security issues are in danger because of, the raggedy edges of the morality or legitimacy of what the organization is doing.
Well, I think you're correct that when an organization is doing things that significant numbers of people in the organization oppose or have real questions about or think that are illegitimate or immoral, you're going to have a lot more leaking taking place. And again, all I'm trying to discuss is how organizations, from their point of view, can do a better job of protecting against insiders. I'm not discussing here whether it's a good thing for a particular organization carrying out particular activities to succeed in protecting its secrets. It's clear that from the point of view of the organization Chelsea Manning was working for, she was a devastating incident. I would also say that Chelsea Manning revealed all sorts of things that shouldn't have been revealed. She dumped cables from all over the world. Among other things, one country's design basis threat was compromised. You don't want to tell the terrorists what they would be up against when you're in your security planning for nuclear facilities. So I would argue that, and I think Chelsea Manning would argue that while she had ethical reasons for what she was doing, she was also very troubled emotionally at the time, and that disgruntlement covers a broad set of things. She was disgruntled about the things she was seeing about the Iraq War. She was also disgruntled about the way she was being treated within the organization. So I do think it's a good example of the fact that organizations have to cope with the disgruntlement issue, which it's amazing to me the very large fraction of insider threat programs that do nothing about disgruntlement and don't even make an attempt to address that part of the problem.
So I think we've got time for one more question. We're coming up against the hour. Steve Fetter, go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering, Matt, what is known publicly about the material unaccounted for in the Apollo facility in the Apollo, Pennsylvania. In the 1960s, there was a buff of 200 or 300 kilograms, and widely rumored that this was... So this was the case, as many of you may know, NUMEC, the Nuclear Materials and Equipment Corporation of Apollo, Pennsylvania, hundreds of kilos of HEU apparently missing, strong quantities of smoke suggesting that it might have been stolen and provided to Israel. And in particular, the president of the organization, Zalman Shapiro, frequently traveled to Israel, had extensive contacts with the top-level officials of Israeli intelligence and the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission, etc. However, the reality is that accounting was so bad back then that I think we'll never know for sure whether a bunch of HEU went missing or whether it's just a really bad set of measurements. And in fact, when this material unaccounted for originally came up in the mid-1960s, that provoked the Atomic Energy Commission to essentially launch a major R&D program on material control and accounting, which led to the development of non-destructive assay technology that's now the main technology used for IAEA safeguards. So, ironically, the main technologies for IAEA safeguards originated in what was probably a theft from one unsafeguarded nuclear program on behalf of another unsafeguarded nuclear program. So I would say balance of evidence, stuff got stolen and went off to Israel. Proof, I think we'll never have it.
Okay. Thank you, Matt. People can get the book. It's on the bookshelves now. So thanks for your talk, and you'll hear from us about next month's webinar. So thanks.
All right. Thank you very much.